also happen to be the immediate past president of American Oil Chemists Society and a member of the Board of Governors there. And it's in that role that we welcome you to the ongoing series sponsored by the AOCS for successful startups. Today's focus is going to be highlighting the process from innovation to an actual business plan. And we've got three fantastic speakers who come at this from, in some ways, very different perspectives in terms of the industries that they've either worked in or they are intending to serve in their current role. But in other ways, very similar. The challenge of taking an idea to a point where it's actually, benefiting consumers and customers around the world is non-trivial, as many of you know, or many of you want to know. And so we've got some fantastic expertise to draw upon for that. And so we hope that this will be a very good experience for you and a lead into future webinars throughout the coming months. We have a very interesting and somewhat very challenging environment in which innovation on its path to commercialization is trying to navigate. As we all know, we're coming off of a global pandemic that has had unexpected and very significant impacts on businesses large and small. Some of our speakers will have some potentially very interesting stories that they've had to experience throughout those periods of time, and hopefully made them smarter and stronger and better. But boy, it wasn't without some pain. I think Sue Lancaster in particular has some interesting tales to tell there, even though they might be cautionary in nature. We also know that there are economic challenges. The inflation post-pandemic is driving up the cost of money, so to speak, and this obviously has an impact on the willingness of investors to invest in new technologies. And so our speakers have a unique perspective on what impact that might be having. And then we also have political factors at work here. The recent executive orders from the current administration in the U.S. on trying to enhance the role of biotechnology and biological processing and what it can or can't do to help facilitate innovation in a number of the spaces that our three speakers are very familiar with is a potential area that you may have some interest and curiosity in. The impact that might have on current and future regulatory landscape is also very relevant. And so our speakers have experienced that throughout their storied careers as well, too. So we think this is going to be a fascinating tale of three entrepreneurs who have come at this from very different perspectives, all with some commonality and purpose of seeing new innovations with definite promise to enhance the lives of people all around the world, and the tales that they have learned and gone through, the tales that they are living as we speak, and trying to anticipate what the future might hold. So with that as an intro, we want this to be a very active experience for those on the webinar. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A section. So please utilize that for any questions that you want to pose to either individual members of our panel or all three members of the panel, depending on your question. Try to use it instead of the chat. Although if you happen to have a question that goes into the chat, our support team at AOCS will monitor that so that we can see that and get it moved over into the Q&A section. So we look for a lively discussion and question and debate, both at the end of the individual speakers' presentations and especially during the panel discussion that'll occur at the very end. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker today is Bryan. He's got, sorry, Bryan, 3 decades of experience in senior leadership in a wide number of industries: agribusiness, biofuels and energy, food. He's also served as management consultant, renewable chemistry, synthetic biology, water, all things very, very interesting. And quite frankly, many of them all interrelated these days as we look at sustainability of manufacture of new types of technology. Bryan, he serves as chair of the Northern California, Nevada section of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. A little more than a decade ago, he was a recipient of the Professional Progress Award from that organization. So belated congratulations there, Bryan. He's authored a number of peer-reviewed papers on various technologies like distillation and biofuel production, gasification. He also serves on the editorial board of Inform, which is a magazine, monthly magazine published by AOCS. He's also a colleague and a member of the governing board of AOCS with me, and I've appreciated his insights and contributions to both of those functions of AOCS. He's a chemical engineer by training, as you might guess. Came to that at the University of Wisconsin. Then he got an MBA from the University of Minnesota, and he's also a registered professional engineer in the state of California. Bryan, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and you're gonna share with us your tale of 3 startups and the challenges that they faced and hopefully overcame. Bryan, back to you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Phil. I guess I probably should leave out the 3 decades, huh? Makes me feel old.
Never too late for a happy childhood is the way I like to look at
it. That's a good way to look at it. So thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you everyone for being with us. And so Phil's gone over a little bit about me, but just to highlight some other things. And so I spent the first 18 years of my career with Cargill. Most of it was in the oil seed processing group. So was involved in a lot of different facilities, from plant operations to construction of a number of plants, a bunch of startups, a bunch of new technologies. Also spent time with corn milling. So I was introduced to the different aspects of corn milling. And then the last stop was with the nutraceutical side of Cargill. From there, I spent 4 years with General Electric, or I should say a company formerly known as the General Electric Company, in the water infrastructure business. And after that, when biofuels started to become hot, I was recruited to a defense contractor then known as Science Applications International Corporation, or SAIC. Today it's known as Leidos. And did a lot of work on biofuels, primarily with the algae to jet fuel project that was sponsored by DARPA. I served as the chief scientist for that. And then later on, we did some work in food safety and food security, primarily on food security issues in the Middle East. And then it was after my time at SAIC that I entered into the world of startups. And so what I'd like to do here is kind of talk about 3 different startups that I either have been or are currently involved with, and a little bit of the lessons learned from that. And so the first startup that I was involved in was a company called Zeachem. And the concept behind this was for the production of cellulosic ethanol using woody biomass. And so you would take the woody biomass, convert that into the C5 and C6 sugars, as well as lignin. Zeachem had identified a bacterial strain known as Morella that is very, very efficient at converting sugars into acetic acid. And unlike organisms like yeast, does not produce any CO2. In fact, all that carbon pretty much goes into the production of either biomass or acetic acid. They would take that acetic acid, then convert it into ethyl acetate and then to ethanol. The lignin that they recover could then be used for either as fuel, or you could potentially gasify it to produce hydrogen, which you would need in order to produce the ethanol. It was a pretty exciting company from a lot of perspectives. Probably of biggest note, if you follow Jim Lane's Biofuel Digest, the company was rated for a number of years as one of the top 10 biofuel companies. It was backed by a number of well-known VC firms. It received a number of state and federal grants. And it had a number of offtake agreements in place, which was not uncommon with a lot of very exciting and successful biofuel companies that were starting to come up around that time. I was recruited to the company and the position, the title they gave was Executive Vice President of Technology. Essentially, it was to replace two individuals who had held the EVP of R&D and engineering, respectively. And the time that I came in was after the research phase of the project. And so the company had started construction of a demonstration plant in Boardman, Oregon. And at the time I came in, the fermentation suite was just starting up. And the two bookends of the process, which would be the acid hydrolysis process that converts the woody biomass into the sugars and lignin, as well as the downstream for converting the acetic acid all the way to ethanol, were still under construction. Later on in the journey, I also served as the chief operating officer of Zeachem. So there was a number of challenges and lessons learned that came during the about 2 years that I spent with Zeachem. One of the ones which may surprise people was a decision that was made to build a demo plant based strictly on the work done at the R&D lab and didn't go through a proper pilot plant. Usually when you deal with new technologies, you go through a pilot plant to try to demonstrate the process, a lab process using relative equipment that you can then scale up to a demo size. And that step was bypassed. The thinking at the time by the company was doing so would help accelerate the whole project. And they didn't, at the time, identify any critical risks. To add to that, the fermentation suite of the plant was designed by engineers who actually had no fermentation experience, even though that was the centerpiece of the technology. And some of the things that may surprise people, surprised me on my first day, were the lines throughout the plant were actually made of PVC. And the fermenters were not set up to have any kind of sterilization. And so automatically bells and whistles would go off, right? Another aspect was they never really tested the fermentation on cellulosic sugars from an acid hydrolysis process. All of the development was done using dextrose that was readily available from Cargill or ADM. And so for those who are familiar with cellulosic sugars, particularly if you use an acid hydrolysis process, there are a lot of other things that end up getting produced. In addition to the C6, the C5 sugars and lignin, you produce some furfural, you produce some HMF, all of which are toxic to microorganisms. And so that complicated the problem. The last thing that was interesting and a lesson learned was when they designed the downstream process, it was designed on what an ideal fermentation broth would look like versus what are some of the other products that could be formed in the fermentation. And so if you assume that the organism will only produce acetic acid, your separation process and conversion process downstream becomes straightforward. If, however, you have any kind of contamination, and so for example, if you were to produce butyric acid or some other acids, then that would get converted as well too. That affects the separation process downstream, and you have further problems. And so sadly, what ended up happening to the company was we ended up having a very high burn rate through operating the demo plant. And it came at a time where a lot of the VCs then started to struggle with money. And so we were unable to secure a bridge loan. And at the same time, crude oil prices dropped, and that led, unfortunately, to the company's collapse. So after that experience, I went to a synthetic biology company called Intrexon. And while Intrexon was involved in a lot of different things, which I'll highlight in the next slide, one of the projects that I was assigned to was to engineer an organism called a methanotroph. And methanotrophs are organisms that essentially use methane as the carbon source versus sugars. And we would engineer these organisms to produce value-added chemicals, such as isobutanol, 2,3-butanediol, or 1,4-butanediol. And again, it was a lot of excitement around the company, particularly early on. One of the key owners of Intrexon, I think he owned about 60%, and the former CEO, Randall Kirk, was well known for being one of the first self-made billionaires in biotech. And at one time, the market cap of the company exceeded $3 billion and had a lot of excitement on the news. In fact, Jim Cramer on Mad Money commented, made some very positive comments about Intrexon in its early days. And I was recruited as vice president of process technology and essentially was involved in running the methanotroph program and building a process engineering team. So when I came in, we were still pretty young. We had about 15 employees, and by the time I left, it had grown to almost over 200 within that group. And the group included, building out a molecular biology group, the analytical group, data science, fermentation, and process engineering. And also in that time, we moved from a lab in San Carlos to one in South San Francisco, where we were able to double the size of the labs and added a pilot plant. But some of the challenges and lessons that we learned here was the methanotroph is not a model organism like yeast or E. coli, and so there was a lot of effort required to learn how do you engineer it, how do you insert the DNA or new strands of DNA into its genome. And with the carbon source being methane and not sugar, the whole concept of gas fermentation was nascent. And so there was a lot of development required in having a very efficient gas fermentation process. Titers, so if you think about when you make wine or beer or ethanol, you hit a limit with product inhibition. And that was a challenge that we had, which was difficult to overcome in some of the compounds that we picked. And as I mentioned, the company was very diversified. And so they got involved in things like engineered mosquitoes to control the spread of various diseases, apples that don't brown, salmon that grow twice as fast, designer cows, and pharmaceuticals. And so there was a lot of dilution in terms of the focus of what we would be working on. And so and by the time we got to our 6th year in the project, it's hard to believe it was that long, it was decided to close the project. And they sold off many of the other IP that they had on the things that I mentioned. But the company continues today as Precigen, and it's focused on gene and cell therapies. Which kind of takes me to the last group that I'm currently involved with, and it started off as American Biodiesel that was doing business as Community Fuels, and it was founded in 2005 by a number of people, primarily in Sonoma County, who wanted to produce biodiesel from refined vegetable oils, and they ended up building the first major biodiesel plant in California. The plant started up around 2008, around the same time that other biodiesel plants started to pop out throughout the country. And unfortunately, not quite a decade later, the company was hit with a very serious environmental violation that led to the incarceration of the plant manager. I was recruited as president and CEO of the company to replace the founding CEO, who sadly was seriously injured in an accident. And one of the challenges when you come into a company that I guess is still sort of in that startup mode is you struggle with working capital needed to run the business. And the role that I had was either you find a good business partner or have the asset acquired by a larger company that can better utilize the asset. And so, one of the things about American Biodiesel was while there were a few design flaws in the plant, it actually ran well, and we were able to convert it to run alternative feedstocks like tallow or used cooking oil, and you would have better margins. We also started to work on establishing appropriate policies and procedures within the organization that would have prevented the environmental violation from occurring. And the facility in Stockton is actually very ideally located for the distribution of low carbon fuels. We're right along major highways, Interstate 5 and Highway 99, that are the major north-south corridors of California, and that tie easily into roads to the Bay Area, Sacramento, Reno, and Fresno. And we have excellent rail and port access. So there are a lot of good things going on at the facility. So what ended up happening was we were fortunate to have been acquired by a Canadian company, Canary Biofuels, that had the objective of reducing carbon emissions through biofuels and related co-products. They had acquired a second generation biodiesel plant in Alberta and will be starting up a crush plant later this month, and is looking to expand its footprint throughout North America. And my role there is Vice President of Engineering and U.S. Operations. So I kind of came with the acquisition, if you will, and part of my role is to help advance the engineering group within the team, and then to kind of look at potential acquisitions within the U.S. So the last couple of things I want to kind of summarize here is, when you're looking at a startup, if there are some lessons learned overall from these three adventures, it's really to look at things in the context of technology readiness level, which is a convenient way of looking at things. And then, when you look at it and just look at kind of the this barometer here, you know, a lot of times when people make their entry into startups, you could be in the research mode or the development mode or the deployment mode. And when you think about biofuels or synthetic biology or anything that involves innovative technologies, what you want to do is utilize as much mature technology as possible to minimize the risk around innovation. And really, the issue becomes using innovation, or excuse me, mature technology in an innovative way rather than having to invent more new technology. And when you do that, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen and I've learned, particularly through the Trexon experience, was this so-called valley of death, which tends to occur when you're in the development phase of the program. And one way to think of it is the gap when you have very academic research that's trying to transition into industrial commercialization. And it's also the point in time where it's most difficult to find the funding, because you end up having a cultural change within the organization as you transition from, gee, I can prove this in the lab, to, gee, how do I make it work at scale? And so you find that oftentimes you would have to change some of the players and the mindset of where you're at. And managing through that, there's probably as many opinions as there are people who care to opine on this, but how you do that, I think, depends on your situation, but it's key to moving it forward to your commercialization phase. And so I'll close out by kind of summarizing a couple of things is, inspiration for a startup oftentimes comes from a concept or idea that we have that is innovative and creates value, right? But the challenge of it really depends on what are the key technical hurdles you have to overcome. What are, your ability to transition, whether if you're starting from research mode to that development deployment mode. And of course, financial fundraising always ends up being a challenge along the way. But if you can minimize your technical hurdles, and if you have the right domain knowledge throughout that entire process, I think that's key to moving that forward. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Phil for any quick questions that we have time for.
Thank you, Bryan. We've got folks from almost all over the world: India, Africa, Middle East, Europe, Canada, Colombia, and so we've got a diverse audience. So I anticipate all sorts of interesting things coming. It sounds like there were a couple of interesting opportunities to mitigate some of the risks in your technical readiness level barometer, as you say, or thermometer, as you have it there. One sounded like the adjacency of engineers to biologists to microbiologists to chemists is oftentimes either taken for granted because a startup is really so focused in a certain technology domain that, particularly when you start to get into scale up and you don't understand really the challenges in the environment that's different between there and the environment at a lab bench, is often tough. It's often difficult because an organization may not have the the financial wherewithal or even the experience to understand that, well, gosh, chemical engineering is important. We never thought about that. From your experience now, after having done this many times now, how do you try to strike a right balance early on in the company to get that sort of critical mass of people who can, I always think of it as there are some people who can think vertically within a discipline, and they're just fantastic within that discipline. But to ask them to think horizontally from discipline to discipline to discipline is sometimes impossible. And then others are these generalists who don't understand maybe the really critical element of a technology. So how do you build teams that have the right sort of blend of vertical thinkers and horizontal thinkers so that you try to mitigate some of these risks inherent in this valley of death as you describe on your slide?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I saw was it's actually much easier said than done. One of the challenges you have is the quantity of problems that you have to solve and the different perspectives. And so, when you take on a challenge of engineering a new organism where there's no background, you require a skill set there. When you take that learning and then how do you accelerate it through fermentation, through process engineering, where you have to worry about downstream and upstream as well. There's a lot of different skill sets that you need. And a lot of it then comes down to how do we exchange that information in a rapid way so that people can start to focus from, okay, I got to this point, to how do I enhance fermentation, and then from there, how do I come up with a more economic downstream recovery? We spent a lot of time trying to, we had these weekly meetings where we, kind of try to go through all the different perspectives. I think one of the challenges, if I were to do it all over again, is how do we get this to gel together? And I think maybe the problem that we tried to solve was too big, on one side. And I think that's one of the hard things to, when you go on, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of excitement. And sometimes it's hard to rationalize, how do we do all of these things and get all these players to play together? It wasn't so much being able to play in the sandbox together. It's just really understanding all the different perspectives that are required to make things happen.
Yeah. Perspective is priceless, isn't it? It seems like. All right, so we'll spend more time on that in the panel, but I think you have a very unique perspective of learnings around focus and adjacency of skills and talents, particularly in emerging industries where there hasn't been a successful roadmap, and you're drawing the map, and that's not always easy, as you have said. Okay, let's go then to our next speaker. Next speaker is Sue Lancaster. She's a Chief Commercialization Officer for South Dakota Innovation Partners, which is a early stage venture capital and management company headquartered in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She's responsible for both risk management and market expansion across a portfolio of health and nutrition companies, and she'll talk about those here in just a moment. Sue has the enviable moniker of being employee number one, and she can tell you all the challenges about that. As a result of that, she's led technology due diligence from prospecting. How do you decide what's a good idea or not a good idea? Once you have that interest and confidence, how do you form a startup company? How do you operate across multiple technology fields that include ag, engineering, and life sciences, in some ways analogous to what Bryan was just talking about, these adjacencies of not just skill sets, but adjacencies of even industries that might be really important for some future supply chains. And Sue has lived that and is living it on a daily basis. She's managed very diverse teams across these functional areas, everything from the market intellectual property, which is a key element here, particularly for startups and how they defend themselves. Product development, operations, logistics, business development, capital management for both private investors. And Sue's had a lot of success with her colleagues about how to get public institutions to fund your ideas. She's got some good expertise there that you could tap into. Collectively, her contributions have helped the company achieve return on investment of over 300-fold from an initial public grant, which is kudos to Sue and her team. Has secured over $200 million of new capital. It's created 100 jobs. So I think 100 families have benefited from Sue's efforts, and $100 million in recurring value creation for the region in which Innovation Partners operates. She's also an engineer. She's a biomedical engineer, a master's degree from the University of South Dakota. She's also black belt in Lean Six Sigma. And she's also been named to the top 25 in business by the Prairie Business Magazine. She won't show you her cowboy boots today, but she's very proud of being a native South Dakotan. So with that, please welcome Sue Lancaster, and she's going to give her talk that she titles The 5 Buckets. So take it away, Sue.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm excited to talk about the 5 buckets of commercialization. So you may have gathered from my introduction that I love to turn great ideas into products and businesses. I was fortunate enough to start doing that right away in my career through Innovation Partners. And Innovation Partners is an early stage investment capital and startup management firm. We started it in about 2008, 2009 with the mission to commercialize research, to spin out into rural communities, to solve global challenges. A big mission, one that I was uncertain of fulfilling once we got started. And you might ask, why that mission? All these great ideas we found were sitting on shelves, particularly at tech transfer offices at universities. And they were thought to be high risk because they've only been tested at a lab scale. And Bryan talked a lot about that too, right? Early stage, high risk. And we wanted to give those early stage, high risk ideas a chance because we knew that pipeline needed to be filled. But we know it would take a lot of work. And we know that more specifically now because we have 2 examples. First is our company Medgene Labs. It's a leader in the new field of platform prescription vaccines. And it's the first USDA licensed facility in the state of South Dakota. And secondarily is our company Hudec, formerly known as Prairie Aquatech. And this is a leader in plant-based fermentation. And as of recently was named the first safe quality food facility in the state as well. So after over a decade, we have a lot of lessons learned, more than I probably care to admit. But these 2 businesses are something the team's pretty proud of. So it was not easy to get started. We reviewed thousands of invention disclosures or ideas out of universities, both in the United States and across the world. In fact, when I started as the first employee, I really had no idea how to look at technology besides from a lab bench kind of way, and not using a roadmap, right? Until I was taught the 5 buckets of commercialization. And then I soon learned it was really important to start assessing early stage ideas in the categories of people, technology, market, your business model and finance, and ultimately intellectual property. So the key here is you may not know exactly what you're looking for, but to give yourself a roadmap, to build yourself a plan is really critical in those early stages. So this is the original invention disclosure form from South Dakota State University on the left. that we licensed to now form HUDEC, which you can see the commercial facility, the interior on the right. And this is our plant-based fermentation company. It started in 2011. We started writing many of grants to demonstrate if we could get traction and to find non-dilutive funding, right? So could we vet this technology without bringing on a bunch of capital, so we could de-risk it as much as we possibly could? We started hiring employees. We started setting up laboratory space. So could you show that this technology worked, not just in the university laboratory, but when you moved it out of the laboratory into a different environment? Which included one site that had a recirculating aquaculture system, and another site where we would have called our fermentation space, that, no kidding, was in an airport hangar. We truly bootstrapped, which much to many of my innovative colleagues is a different type of innovation to be able to do. So in 2013, we received a grant from the National Science Foundation for $500,000. And from that point, we went on to building a pilot plant facility. And then ultimately that led to our commercial production facility, which is a 30,000 ton fermentation facility creating plant-based proteins. So the key here is really not about all those little steps, writing a bunch of grants, but to ultimately finding your momentum. And for us, that really came with the award of that National Science Foundation grant, because what it did for us is that it was an external source validating your technology, right? Someone was saying, this science makes sense, the business makes sense, the market makes sense. And that allowed us to feel confident to go out, ask for more money, to get more support in order to ultimately get to our commercial facility. So the key here to me is work to find that momentum. And one of the key pieces of the 5 buckets is timing. So the timing of the right hires, so the right people you have on your team, the timing of the market, and so on and so forth. It may surprise you to know that technology and people, while they are absolutely critical to a startup success, timing is actually the main reason most startups fail. And so at HUDEC, when we got started, if you look on the right, you can see world aquaculture production increased drastically. And that's the foundation we were built on, is fermenting plant-based proteins for aquaculture. Because while the demand of aquaculture production increased, there's a need for sustainable ingredients to support that production. So that really was the tailwinds, the timing for us to move forward. And we see that currently with US soy crush capacity. You've probably seen all of that soy crush capacity news coming online. They're crushing more soybeans to make oil, to ultimately make biodiesel. Well, that's leaving a bunch of soybean meal on the market. And we find it important to upcycle that with our fermentation process to not only serve aquaculture, but new products for pet food, human food, and ultimately precision fermentation. So the important message here is always be cognizant of timing. The reality, though, is that timing is not always perfect. People will often affectionately refer to poor timing as the valley of death. And this is when you discover the 5 buckets become really important about how you thought about that. So we started the investment firm during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So again, not great timing. And between that period and our commercial facility, there were plenty of moments. I remember offering up my paycheck on several of occasions, been told no at hundreds, I hope it's not thousands, of customers and investment opportunities. And then when you think everything is going well and you open the doors to a brand new 30,000 ton fermentation facility that you're going to sell product to all over the globe, a pandemic hits 6 months after you open that facility. And so travel stopped, logistics stopped, as all of you know. And this is when you discover that how you thought about those 5 buckets really matters. Did you bring on the right investors that would weather the storm with you? Did you bring on the right team members that would help you work through these challenging times. So you'll often see the valley of death looks like one dip and then a trajectory upwards. But in reality, I find the ride a little bit bumpier than that. So timing is not always perfect. Resilience is necessary. And then Bryan alluded to this too, focus is necessary. So I mentioned focus because distraction is very common in startups. There's a lot of outside noise. Often people run out of money very quickly because they're not staying focused. And focus doesn't mean that you have this grand vision and you're just going to go make it happen no matter what. It's that you're cognizant of how to iterate around the 5 buckets. So you pivot when you need to pivot, right? You change direction when you need to change direction. So I asked the question, does everyone know what tree swing you're building? That may be a little bit of a confusing statement, or maybe nobody has asked you that question before. But what I mean is, are you describing your idea clearly? Does your business make sense? Do you have a clear picture of what your roadmap is? Because without clarity and without a plan, people will not buy in, whether it's a new hire or an investor. So testing the 5 buckets is incredibly important. And actually, in preparing for this webinar, I looked at an old pitch deck prior to this presentation, and I thought to myself, no wonder so many people said no. But those no's are so important because they're part of the journey. And it's how you get investor feedback. It's how you get customer feedback. So what I leave you with is know what tree swing you're building and make sure everybody knows what your tree swing looks like. And that's true not only for the market and for investors, but when you bring on new team members and you're trying to scale and grow, that type of clarity is critically important. So once you have your business running and your idea is going and everything's perfect, you're earning your right to innovate. A phrase used by one of my colleagues and mentors, and a great example here is Corning's breakthrough in innovation. And it talks about the 160 years of innovation. And I love this because it demonstrates that the first one is often very hard to scale, to reach market, but the lessons you learn after that allows you to innovate more quickly, or smarter, with the right people and with the right resources. So innovation is exciting and new ideas are incredibly exciting, but we also have to do the heavy lifting to bring those innovations to market in order for us to solve global challenges. So in closing, I saw this great image from Harvard Business Review the other week, and it resonated with me for 2 reasons. The first is that we are in an incredible time with science, especially when you look at biology and fermentation, which have been around a lot longer than we have here, and applying it in new ways, right? In a new field. So I love this perspective. And then lastly, it reminded me, especially for first-time entrepreneurs, whether you're 25, you're 75, or you're a young scientist, and this was a lesson that I've tried to learn, is that experience does not have to be measured in years, simply by the number of experiences. So I think that's always a good take-home message. So in closing, all I want you guys to remember is use the 5 buckets, be aware of timing, know how to communicate your tree swing, and go ahead and take the first step so you can start generating more experiences. So thank you for having me, AOCS, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Sue. So you're it's not the years, it's the miles kind of person, right? Yep. Well, for those of us at the end of the career path, that's a lesson that we should keep every day, right?
Absolutely.
I had a couple questions come in while you were giving your talk. So first of all, thanks for that. That's a great perspective. 2, and I think this relates also to Bryan's comments. And that is around the critical importance of pilot plant before you go to scale up. And the question is this: how do you go about securing funding for that because if that pilot plant doesn't result in actual products for sale, and parenthetically they say immediately, investors might not be interested in that, and they may be looking for quicker returns, even if they don't have the right perspective of how critical scale up is and how important pilot facilities are for making that de-risked transition from bench to pilot to commercial facility. Having lived that, you have thoughts on that? How
I do.
do you go justify the investment in those facilities for people who may not understand the value of pilot facilities?
And that's a great question, and definitely something that we contemplated too, because we were looking at contract manufacturing, right, and having someone else do some piloting for us. But we quickly learned that that was going to be really expensive, and we probably weren't going to learn as much in that period of time. And so our CEO worked with an economic development on the national side of things and partnered that with our local economic development to get additional funds for our pilot plant construction. So that can be difficult to do. And I think that's one of the balances for startups that you have to make is you try to bring on additional capital to go faster. In our case, we probably were a little bit more methodical and slower so that we could have those resources available to us. So there's definitely non-dilutive funding out there to at least match investor funds. So I'd always look for that. And if you can't find traction, I mean, contract manufacturing and piloting is not a bad option, right? You just want to make sure, like Bryan said, you want to have the right people around to make sure you're getting the right data to demonstrate that you can scale up.
Yeah, let's save that for the panel, because I do think that's a very interesting challenge and dilemma for startups is, do I bite the bullet and invest in building it myself or ourselves, or can I partner with people who might have that skill set and maybe manage some of the financial risks, but the partner may not be as fully invested as you are, in the day to day and the ultimate outcome. So let's hold off on that. And we've had a couple of questions come in the chat. One for Bryan that we'll hold off to the panel. But again, for the audience, please use the Q&A for your questions. We'll look at the chat. We'll pull them over, but try to put them in the Q&A. So Sue, thanks. We're gonna move on now to Dr. Anthony Clark. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Helaina, which is a New York City-based biotech company, which is fascinating technology platform. They are pushing the boundaries of what food can do for health, as you'll see in a few moments. Helaina is the first company to bring the immunity properties of breast milk with the potential to food for all stages of life, not just for infants. And in doing so, bridging the gap between food and medicine. Dr. Clark leads both the innovation function as also regulatory and scientific affairs. So I'm sure he will have some very interesting perspectives on the challenges that not only Helaina's faced, but other companies that he has worked with. But this food medicine continuum is one that has very stringent regulatory requirements, and so his perspective will be quite interesting in that regard. Anthony brings extensive knowledge of the path to commercialization and regulatory freedom to operate and just the overall regulatory landscape. He has got a quarter century of experience. Prior to his current role, he's held a number of executive technology positions at small companies like Myco Technology, Chromacell, to very, very large ones like PepsiCo and Firmenich and IFF. And he and Bryan were colleagues at Trexon for a while too. So over the course of his career, Dr. Clark has designed, scaled, and industrialized many fermentation-derived ingredients for both the food industry as well as flavor and the fragrance industries. He's the inventor on more than 50 international patent applications. He's authored 70 plus scientific publications. He's a Scotsman, born in Glasgow. He earned his PhD from University of Leeds, and then he got an MA from Cambridge, where his research focused on natural product chemistry and fermentation process development. And so with that, we're going to turn it over to Anthony, and he's going to give a talk on learnings from synthetic biology, fermentation, and food biotech startups. Thank you, Anthony, and we look forward to your presentation. Take it away.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to the AOCS for the opportunity to talk to you today about learnings on some of the synbio fermentation and food biotech startups I've worked on. Just as Sue was mentioning, I've got both the miles and the years in this space, so probably I'll go to the BioSketch right now, and just to summarize what Phil was saying. Yeah, I've been around here for quite a while and kind of been on the bleeding edge of synthetic biology and fermentation technology for quite a while. And so what I thought I would do is talk about two of the processes that are developed whilst being at large organizations, IFF and Firmenich, and those both working with startup companies in the biotech space, and then on to some fun learnings from Intrexon, Myco, and now Helaina. So whilst at Firmenich, and the reason I joined in 2000 was to build their biotechnology platform. Firmenich is a large flavor and fragrance company, and at that time they had actually nobody was called anything other than a chemist. Everybody was a chemist in the company, so everybody had to be a chemist. So even I was a chemist, even though my background's in biology. But I set up all the microbiology, molecular biology, and the major project that we were successful with was ultimately cloning the pathways to patchouli oil, which is the single largest natural fragrance raw material that you can find, and so had a reasonable market. And we cloned the genes from the patchouli plant, and we put them into various organisms. Up here you can see, and we put them in tobacco and in other microorganisms. But ultimately, the project with Saccharomyces was the one that we scaled, and we scaled that in conjunction with Ameris, which was a biotech startup in Emeryville, California. That process was scaled, and ultimately it was in 2016 they were at about 400 metric ton scale, which doesn't seem a lot when you're talking about soy meal crushing and stuff like that, but the flavor and fragrance industry, that was still, I think, is the largest biotech process for a natural. And then at IFF, similarly, they were working with Evolver, and again, to pathway engineer directly from sugar to flavor material, in this case, vanillin, which is the principal aroma compound in vanilla extract. And here, there's only a few genes. It was 4 or 5 genes that were engineered away from the shikimate pathway. But the problem there was when you develop this process, vanillin has a toxicity to the host organism. And so what the Evolver guys did is they came up with a strategy to glycosylate the vanillin, which reduced the toxicity. So you could accumulate very, very high titers of the product, and then deglycosylate the product after the fermentation process and liberate the product. And that was successful to an extent, and we can come on to talking about to the extent, because the issue there was that the technology seemed to be so much more sustainable than existing technology, which really derives vanillin from wood pulping industry. You know, the lignin that Bryan was talking about that you can produce from some of these bagasse and other processes can be converted into vanillin. So that's completely synthetic and it's not a very nice process and certainly not sustainable. So IFF thought they would market that as a natural sustainable route to vanillin, and ultimately that didn't resonate with the consumer. So the bottom line there is best not to talk about the process sometimes, just talk about the benefits of the product. So that's a learning there. But overall, from those two, you can see that the technology is amazing. You know, several pathways can be engineered, whole pathways can be engineered. The titers of terpenes that can be produced in Saccharomyces now are very high in other organisms. That's been done also today, and it's effectively the birth of a new technology, right? And we are just at the beginning. We have to remind ourselves we're still at the beginning of this technology, and we don't have all of the pieces in place yet. And then some of the learnings with will resonate with what Sue and Bryan were saying earlier is often you underestimate the time commitment needed to make these things happen. And if you look at the patchouli process, probably about 14-15 years for that process from start to finish. Starts to get a bit tricky when you're looking for an ROI on that. But ultimately, you're always going to have some tension also between the biotech partners and the industrial partners who have different business models and are working towards different agendas in many respects. And as you can see from a technical standpoint, novel ingredients are always going to be problematic. There's always going to be issues that you have to get over. Whether that's design of new equipment or design of a new process like the glycosylation. The reason I kind of moved out of the flavor and fragrance space is that the cost of the R&D was too high for a good ROI and some of those returns, right? So you need to look at the business case, and I think we have enough experience now and business cases now to be more accurate with how we can do the techno-economic modeling, so that we can reasonably expect to be more successful. But as having said that, the cost of the technology is also coming down to some extent with the advances of CRISPR and things like that. So moving on to the startup world, I'll start with Intrexon. My office was next to Bryan's, and I was the head of the R&D for all the other stuff that Bryan wasn't doing with gas fermentation. So we were looking at many routes to many compounds, APIs in particular, but we were trying also to look at industrial products. But the largest project we had was working towards thebaine, which is the major precursor for opioid drugs. And you can see in this panel, that's 14 enzymatic steps after tyrosine. It's quite a challenge, and probably, I think, one of the biggest biotech projects that you could imagine. Ultimately, I mean, we Intrexon was successful in making small amounts of thebaine, but never at the titers that could get the commercial reality. But what they did was extremely interesting, and something that I've taken on through all the rest of my career is streamlining lab operations and building knowledge management systems through lab operations. And that goes from, training scientists to work in a completely different way. If you build an integrated team of molecular biologists for doing strain engineering and enzyme engineering, that's fine, but they also have to connect through to the guys that are going to screen those things, and then the guys that are going to scale those up, and then ultimately to the engineers. And I think, as Phil already mentioned, there's always some dynamic tension between the lab guys and the engineers, and that will probably always be the case. But to get around that to some extent, these design, build, test, learn cycles were put in place. And then once you have your cycle for innovation, down in the little scheme on the left there, if you can improve the productivity of one of those cycles by 50%, that's the orange line compared to the blue line over a year. You have an exponential increase in your success going forward. So focusing then on building a design, build, test, learn cycle, and then making it faster, and then making what goes into that cycle more impactful through automation and high throughput. And I think I share with Bryan why Intrexon ultimately wasn't that successful is because we were doing way too many things, and but it was really fun time, and through it learned quite a lot about how not to build a solid business case and a techno-economic model. So something that you've got to start off with, and that comes into talking about Sue's 5 buckets of commercialization. So then on to Myco. I was the chief science officer at Myco for nearly 5 years. Here we have a completely different specialized fermentation technology looking at mushroom mycelia. So basically growing food, making a food platform using mushroom roots in a fermentation system. So I think the strategy taken there, I mean, the company was set up in 2013, so it's nearly 10 years now. Will be 10 years this year. And the approach taken there was to really build a very solid IP platform around this niche technology. Initially, they started with solid state fermentation of coffee, tea, and cacao, but then moved into submerged culture and commercialized alternative fermented proteins, and now are in the process of scaling up mycelia as a food ingredient in its own right. So, in doing so, once you have that portfolio package, you can rapidly and flexibly move to different products, right? So they generate a pipeline of very interesting ingredients. So lion's mane fermented coffee, which can, takes away some of the bitterness of poor grade coffee and maybe gives you some cognitive benefits at the same time. Cordyceps fermented extracts for taste enhancing, self-texturized alternative meat products, and then the one that's commercialized, the shiitake fermented pea and rice protein, which is available, and now they're scaling mushroom biomass and have a commercial path forward for a high intensity sweetener discovered in mushrooms. So mushrooms can do a lot of things. So what you see is that if you combine that strong vision with a unique technology, and they have modest but growing revenue and a very strong IP portfolio, you can create a very, very strong market cap for the company and a successful platform for it to be moved on. Happy to talk more about that later. And then Helaina was founded in 2019, and as Phil mentioned, it's a food biotech company pushing the boundaries of healthy food, right? So the idea is to create through fermentation immunonourishing glycoproteins that bring those immunity properties of breast milk to food for all stages of life, focused initially on infants, but clearly these work in care of the elderly and sports nutrition and many other areas. And something that, if Sue was talking about the 5 buckets, team is probably the most important one. I think from an Helaina standpoint, Laura Katz is very inspiring and has put together a really amazing business and science team, and so and that's what attracted me to the position, with the compelling science that you can take compelling science and turn it in a platform technology that can then actually be used for innovation. So how is Helaina going to be successful? Again, it kind of comes down to those 5 buckets. You have to have intellectual property. That's got to be built around what you do as a technology, but it can also be built around what applications you have as you're going into the market. And then what Helena's done really very well is get to scale as quickly as possible. Company founded in 2019, it's only 2023. That's pretty remarkable speed. We will be at 45,000 litres next month. So that's really quite impressive. And all that with a capital efficient model that they've worked on, mainly using contract manufacturing organizations. And once you do that, then you don't have a gas reactor that you have to build and maintain. You don't have new technology you have to work with you, but then you're constrained with working with the technologies that your partners have and making sure that you select the right partners with the right technology. And then for these novel ingredients, which are really pushing the boundaries of what food can be, you have to get to GRAS. You have to get to general recognition of safety, and that has to be through an FDA route. But the first thing to do is get self-affirmed GRAS, and that's what the company's focused on this year. And making sure that you've got behind that some precedents. So we've got Perfect Day and Remilk who've been there and trodden that path. And then behind that, okay, you've got the approval. Then how do you get to market? You've got to have a very good strategy of who are you going to work with, where is the growth going to come from the early adopters, so the gazelles, if you like, and then going to the bigger guys, the elephants in the room, and picking one of those guys to actually drive market growth. So I think from the common themes from all of this, I think to be a successful startup, you really need a compelling narrative and something that differentiates you from others. And that's another reason why I think Helaina is very unique. You need to understand the problem you're trying to solve, and that often, in the past, with I think looking at thebaine as the example, maybe it's the problem that we shouldn't have been trying to solve anyway. Was that the right thing to go after in the first place? And no matter how good the science is, it's irrelevant if there is no perception from the consumer that your product is going to work for them. And then the two main things I think that really you need to have in the startup world relative to anywhere else is speed. You have to be faster than the next guy, and you have to be really flexible. And finally, building a team to get you through all of those challenges is very challenging, but is probably the most important thing, because ultimately investors invest in people, and that way you will get the finance and the runway you need to make it happen. I think that's all I got.
Thanks, Anthony. I love the last point, right? Investors invest in people. It's the best resource, best set of assets that companies have. It's nice to show pictures of stainless steel tanks and pipes and everything, and those are critical too. But it was the people that made it all happen, right? And will make it happen. So lesson learned for the audience. Going to start with a little bit of specifics and some maybe some logistics around the presentations. There's interest on the part of the audience in the decks. There always is. Anthony, I noticed your slides had confidential labeled on them, so there may be some that are not shareable. But I would point the audience to the AOCS staff. If you guys are willing to share your decks, we'll get them to the support team at AOCS, and then they can work with the audience members. But please, as authors of the decks, you make the call as to what's shareable and what's not, because there is a lot of good technical information there. Sue, there's a question beyond just wanting a copy of your deck. Please repeat the 5 buckets. Bucket 1, people. Bucket 2, technology. Bucket 3, market. Bucket 4, question mark. What's the 4th bucket?
You need intellectual property and
There
your
you
business model / finance.
Yep. Okay. So there's that one. Another question for you, Bryan, and I'm going to expand it a little bit because I do think it's relevant directly and indirectly to all of these industries, and that is you experienced a situation with one of your companies where there was a pretty substantial change in the price of petroleum, and it had a big impact on your value proposition, the financial elements of your value proposition. We also know that the petroleum industry is the raw material of a lot of intermediates that go into a number of products that we might be competing with green chemistries. How do you guys identify the sensitivity analyses of those types of changes that could really knock you out of the water, so to speak? Do you approach it in any particular way so that you understand when you have a profound change in the financial environment that you're trying to innovate in? Can you guys each describe how you do that? And petroleum's a great base case, but I know, Sue, from your standpoint, things like alternative protein ingredients like fish meal and others, these are analogous situations. How do you identify the most likely alternatives to your success? And then what do you do to understand what that sensitivity analysis is? And don't let it paralyze you, but understand how challenging it would be if things change by a certain degree. How do you guys go about doing that with your 3 situations? Sue, maybe you go first because you're in a highly competitive industry with food and feed ingredients. Can you start us off there, and then we'll go to Bryan and then Anthony.
Yeah, of course. So, for us to find most likely alternatives, right, or actually understand who you're competing against, I always think going to customer first, right? So voice of the customer and getting that feedback, because most often they're going to tell you who you're working to replace, right? Or who you're competing against, whether it be on price or value proposition or all the above in many of instances. And so from a most likely alternative standpoint, I mean, definitely looking at what the market's doing, but really being in tune to the customer, I think is most critical. In terms of being competitive and what you need to monitor in terms of keeping your business sustainable, you obviously have to have some leniency within your financial models to know what's most critical. What's your raw materials going into your product, and where's there the most risk, and then making sure that you have the right team of people assessing that risk, managing that risk. All those things are hard to make sure they're buttoned up, especially if you have resource gaps. But it's also really important in our experiences, make sure that as you're doing product introductory or new product introductory, that takes time, and make sure that you have some runway to be able to offer free product or to offer something at a discount, because in the early stages, you're looking for feedback to make your product better. You're probably not going to provide the perfect product right out the gate. So you want to plan for that.
The classic minimum viable product to start, right?
There you
and then
go.
how do you innovate on top of that quickly and effectively? Bryan, you've been at the pointy end of the stick on petroleum pricing. What's your perspective on how do you mitigate the risk there? I know it's
Yeah,
tough.
well, I think in the case of Zeachem, it was hard to do because at the time when there was a lot of interest, crude oil prices climbed to over $100 a barrel at that time. And so you can make the case that says, hey, if it ever drops by 25, 30%, we're still fine because we can make it at the equivalent of $50, $60 a barrel if everything goes right. One of the challenges we had in our project was really a very high capex required to do plant number one. And when the crude oil price then dropped to around 50, suddenly there was no margin left, right? And it became very difficult to argue for serial number one with no margin. And so I think in that case, it was just not conceivable at the time that the price could drop by that much. In the case of Intrexon using natural gas, unlike crude oil, the natural gas prices stayed flat for well over a decade, maybe more than that, at $3 a million BTU or $3.50 a million BTU. And so the business case around why we pursued gas fermentation was to leverage the cheap natural gas that was available. And then when you do all the conversion costs, assuming that you hit the titers, then you could have quite the business case. And that ended up being the problem, right? Was not getting to the titers where you can get the processing costs low enough to close that business case. But the concept, from the math standpoint, worked. And we modeled it at several fold increases on natural gas prices. So that was a little bit different. But I think what we learned along the way too was you have to go beyond that in terms of what is the relative efficiency of the microorganism. I was talking about the Zeachem organism that was very good at utilizing all the carbon. But if you do the analysis like we had to do at Intrexon, you incorporate all these new genes inside the organism. It took we had a really great person that was able to figure this out, but then suddenly you realize, gee, maybe the machine that we are creating is not as efficient as we think it is. And we try to model that into the costs as well. And then finally, you go to today and you look at what are some of the motivations, in addition to having a low carbon fuel standard that's being implemented in states and incentives, that help mitigate some of the other things. The other thing that we're also seeing too is, and I don't know that I want necessarily greenwashing, but there's a lot of interest in sustainable aviation fuels and where is that feedstock going to come from. And that's why, in Canada, we are looking at alternative oilseed crops that we can use that would have a lower carbon footprint, build crushing plants to produce that oil, and then be able to ship that oil to the different refiners. And so it's a little bit of a different business model, and it, in trying to mitigate, some of the fluctuations that we've seen, we have tried to come up with, windows that we think are likely, and it's still a guessing game and all that.
So things like camelina and alternative oil seeds, is that
Yep.
what you're referring? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a great place where AOCS's perspective can really lend a lot of insights. Any comments about what do you do for all the co-products when you extract the oil and get it ready for those applications? How do you consider managing the risk of innovation of not doing anything to the co-products, but also not taking your eye off the prize of the
the co-products, actually ends up being the largest percentage of the output, right? In the case of a crushing plant. And so we've been working closely with customers on perspectives as to what could make sense for them and what are some of the value adds. And so for an example, I'll use the example of cold pressing versus solvent extraction, right? You can leave some of that oil in there, but they may have interest in that oil because of the fatty acid profile and how that might affect products like eggs or milk downstream. And so those are some of the discussions that you have to try to establish, okay, is there value or not? Is there value in digestibility of the cold pressed product versus a solvent extraction product? So we work pretty closely with that. And there's a number of thought leaders in Canada that we work closely with to try to help better define that, so that it's not something that will blindside you. Because in that particular case, if you just to make up numbers, if you have 100 tons of seed come in and only 32 tons of oil coming out, then the rest is all your co-product, right? And so extracting that value becomes critical, particularly if you don't extract all of it out.
The pile gets pretty big in the back of the plant if you don't have a good
Sure
home
does.
for it. Yeah. Well, Sue may want to have some conversations with you about that co-product valorization. She's
Absolutely.
she lives that every day. Okay, Anthony, we haven't forgotten about you. So back to the Intrexon days. If you look at the chemical synthetic pathways, I guess ultimately a lot of those are ultimately petroleum based, or at least indexed to them. How did you, when you're dealing with these really fascinatingly intricate synthetic pathways, how did you deal with titer and the economic sensitivity, if you will, of alternative routes to make the same material? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the innovator's conundrum, right? So you're always up against trying to de-risk the project and trying to get a reasonable techno-economic model which would compete with petrochemical based or give you some advantage. So for small molecules, the advantages are stuff that chemistry can't make, so that you can command a higher price for. So regio selective or stereo selective molecules like flavors and fragrances. That's why we did all of that. But ultimately, there's a lot of there's not that many molecules out there that you can make more than 100 metric tons of in the F&F space. And then you've got to recover all of the research dollars for making that strain and then scaling that process. And it becomes very challenging. I think as we've gone through effectively one set of patent cycles now, since I started my career, they're all coming off patent now. That some of this technology may become more open source, so that people coming into the space now, there are maybe platform organisms which weren't accessible before that people can jump onto now, and then attack some of these problems again, and maybe get successful strains that can then be scaled up. But I would argue that and you see in the protein space, the food protein space, and there are pretty large players who are trying to scale these ingredients for food and commodity products. And already they're pivoting away from the food side because it's really challenging to make the techno-economics work. So they're moving towards more functional proteins that can be used at lower inclusion rates and command a higher price. And obviously, therefore, the volumes are obviously going to be much less, but you can still make a pretty solid business case for those. But I think ultimately for this platform to be more successful, we have to look to, I guess, the regulatory authorities and the government to be helping create a true bio-based economy, somewhat based on subsidies. I mean, the technology exists to make farnesene and biofuels, as Bryan was talking about, but it doesn't seem to be competitive with petrochemicals. So as we're trying to move away from petrochemicals, we need to have some incentive in this space which allows a subsidy for building a bioreactor, which will ultimately stimulate the entire economy. Bit like you do for anything, like electric cars, they're all subsidized, and solar panels are all subsidized. So why not bioreactors? I just don't get it.
Yeah, exactly. Then that's where we don't yet have good line of sight as to what the executive order out of the Biden administration will really, where's the teeth of that? All right, it's aspirational, but what industries will be prioritized? What will how will help be quantified, et cetera, et cetera. If you really want to make these kinds of profound changes, you just don't do them overnight. So that's why I say there's some very interesting political dynamics that we'll have to be on top of. Even the sustainable biodiesel conversation changed dramatically in December. EPA standards become real important, and all of a sudden, if there's arguments about that, then and if it goes one way or the other, then suddenly, expansion of the industry is slowed, and it has all sorts of collateral impacts. So it's a very, very dynamic time financially and politically. So we have to stay on top of it. As we start to drive towards the end of our time here, there's a couple of others. There's some regulatory things here. Anthony, there's some questions in particular. Congratulations on the presentation. Very very interesting. From a safety and a regulatory landscape perspective on these human glycoproteins, you describe the risks you think that there might be to obtaining GRAS with ingredients on that versus self-affirmed GRAS, and what's Helaina doing to try to address any of these challenges on impact on the immune system, and maybe some other things that people have questions about glycoproteins in general?
That's a great question. Somebody obviously knows quite a lot about space. So, I mean, that's the raison d'être for Helaina is to meet that challenge, is to meet the regulatory authorities with all of the best science available, to make the most cogent arguments possible, and create the narrative to make very, very compelling for humanized glycoproteins from a recombinant fermentation process to be allowed in food. And for that, we're fully focused on self-GRAS. So I don't know if you know about the GRAS process, but those who don't, once you self-GRAS, you've basically gone through the scientific argument with an expert panel, and they've agreed that your product is generally regarded as safe based on published data in the domain. So you have to put out the papers that show that, and that's what we're in the process of doing. And then from there, you submit to the FDA, and we are in discussions with the FDA pre to those submissions as well. And then from there, we'll move it forward that way. At the same time, go with the same dossier to the European Food Safety Authority and begin to have the material approved for Europe and beyond.
Okay, thank you. Question for really all of you comes from Casey, who attended via LinkedIn. From a regulatory perspective, what are the agencies asking you about the actual process itself? Product's one thing, but what kinds of questions are you getting about strain stability and other aspects of the manufacturing process, whether it's biological or chemical physical manufacturing? Can you guys comment on that in each of your three areas? Anthony, why don't you start there with the intricate processing that you're talking about with Helaina?
Yes, so I mean, Helaina, Myco is the same thing, grassifying shiitake fermented proteins, which you would think would be easy, right? It's shiitake, it's proteins, you put them together, mix them up. How hard could that be? But no, the FDA doesn't grassify processes. So they only grassify the ingredient through an acceptable process where you have mitigated all the risks in the process to show that the material coming out of that process can be generally regarded as safe. And so for each process, so I guess you can rely on previous submissions using a similar process to help bridge to your process and for your ingredient. But as such, you don't get a blank check for grassifying the process, so you can switch from one ingredient to another. And then from the gene stability, yeah, all of that, the genetic drift in the strain, all of that has to be monitored over several generations, and all of that information has to be made ready and available.
Sue, you want to comment from your standpoint?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we approach the regulatory authorities in two avenues, just depending on market. So AFCO for, aquaculture ingredients, pet food ingredients. And then on the grass side of things, similar to what Anthony's talking about, for human food applications. And so you have the benefit, if all of your ingredients are considered generally regarded as safe, to pursue that route, which is a positive. But as he indicated, you still have to show all your cards in terms of process to demonstrate end product safety, right? So even though all the inputs might be generally regarded as safe, it doesn't mean when you put them together that it is safe. So I do think there's there's an opportunity in the future, I hope, for regulation to look at a lot of these platforms, like I think Anthony's talking about, to demonstrate safety so that you can put product into market quicker. And I know it's everyone's intent to make sure it's safe and of quality. And I think platforms have the opportunity to accelerate that platform, hopefully in the future.
So, Bryan, from describe the biofuels regulatory agency. Who do you have to interface? There. Give us some insight from that part of the innovation perspective.
Yeah. In a way, it's a little bit simpler because, in the case of, say, biodiesel, as an example, there's a defined process that you essentially take triglycerides, you react it with methanol to produce the methyl fatty acid ester. And so from that standpoint, it's pretty straightforward in order to kind of get in. Now, the California Air Resources Board will have its perspective on how do you define the pathway in which it's produced, pathway being, all of the inputs that contribute to carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the same kind of goes for when we deal with the RINs credits. But I think, the bigger issue then for us becomes actually more of the customer and what the customer wants with regards to the product. And in the case of something like biodiesel, we're finding that those initially used to be, well, in cold weather, you want the cloud point to be X, and then in warm weather, it can be Y. And now we're starting to see more and more issues with regards to what that product looks like, because as you blend it into renewable diesel versus petroleum-based diesel, the compounds in petroleum-based diesel enables the biodiesel to mix, I'm going to simplify, to mix more easily than renewable diesel. Once you start to do renewable diesel, then there's a few other things that they look out for to ensure that it blends in. And so coming up with a product that kind of meets the customer expectations actually ends up becoming the much bigger issue for us. And I'll, and talk about, some of the chemicals that you derive from the chemistry standpoint. One of the things we learned at Zeachem when we produce acetic acid, one thought was, well, why don't we just make this green acetic acid? And what we learned very quickly was it wasn't that simple, because while you can meet a certain spec sheet that says, hey, this is acetic acid, it meets your spec sheet. The spec sheet's designed for acetic acid made by a certain process. And once you start to use a biological process, you can introduce other compounds that weren't contemplated before at a very, very small concentration level, but it affects their downstream process. And so I think for us, the big factor really ended up being the customer interaction. And the Trexon side, one of the co-products that came with our fermentation process was a biomass. And as you know, some companies like Unibio and Callista are promoting biomass that's produced from natural gas using a methanotroph. Challenge was our methanotroph was genetically engineered. And so now you have to go through a whole new process of trying to get it accepted through AFCO and through customers. And we didn't make it through the whole testing process, but what was in front of us was a pretty lengthy process to get it approved for incorporation into the feed market.
Okay, we're a little over, but I can't resist this one last question for all of you. It comes from the audience, and the comment is it's fascinating to see how excitement about a particular idea can actually put at risk its success, because it may blind you to or obscure you to the harsh light of reality, so to speak. So what do you do to make sure that the management team is disciplined enough and does not get distracted with trying to chase all aspects of a particular idea, and maybe they take on too many ideas versus focusing on a smaller number? And obviously focus could be terrific, but it could also be dangerous. But then also chasing every idea becomes a butterfly chasing opportunity. So from your perspective of your careers, I know you've all have faced those challenges of how do you manage the excitement of all kinds of great ideas versus the boring success of a smaller number of ideas that actually made it to commercialization. Can you comment for us, and then we'll close up today's webinar. Bryan, you want to start?
Well, I think Anthony and I have the same story on a place we worked together at, and that was hard. I don't know that either of us were very successful at that because it's, I think you get very much blindsided by the potential that suddenly there's a bit of hubris that sets in, that you think you can solve every problem. And really the most important thing is picking the ones that are worth solving and that can create the most value, rather than trying to demonstrate you can do it all. And that's really hard job to do. I know both of us spent a lot of time on that discussion point, and it wasn't easy. I think it is, I mean, I don't have a solution per se, other than you advocate what you think is right and you stay focused to your specific mission. But it's very easy for the wider audience to get very distracted.
Yeah. Anthony, why don't you go next, and then we'll wrap up with Sue.
I think you have to have a little bit of process, right? So there's well-known innovation processes out there that gated processes, stage gate process, that kind of stuff, so that you have to have some kind of review and allow people to go off and have their scatty ideas and pursue them to a certain extent. And then you need to bring them back and review them, and then prioritize based on the strategy of the company. You know, so you can map them strategically with the goals of the company, and that's what we do. We map them against strategic fit, and then the right to win, and the market opportunity. And basically, we map all our ideas that way, and then we go after the bubbles up to the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Seen many of those charts. Then the big bubbles up to the right, right? Not the
the big ones. Really big ones.
The big ones up to the right. That's a mantra that we should all follow. Okay, Sue, you're going to bring us home. We never struggle with any of that at Hudak, do we?
No, and I think Bryan and Anthony hit the nail on the head with it. It is very hard, right? Because you think the next big idea is an important idea, and oftentimes it is. It just might not be the right time. So one of the big things I think we try to do is, at least at the executive team level, to have a filter, right? What's our filter, even if it's a simple 5 questions, so we can put something in the parking lot. I like to use that phrase, right? This is important, but we'll come back to it. And we might come back to it when we're generating enough revenue to engage in having that project generate revenue into the future. So that'd be the big one to me, is having the filter and knowing to put things in the parking lot. And like I said, that's hard to do, but with the right team of people, you continue to get better at it.
Excellent. Well, the time has flown by. I hope the audience has enjoyed it as much as I have. Three terrific perspectives from very, very different industries, but with a common theme throughout a lot of it. So I hope those learnings will be useful for the audience. Please reach out to AOCS with additional questions. We are going to make available the recording for the attendees. So if you want to come back and listen to parts of it, you'll have that at your disposal as well too. I know that'll generate interesting questions, and so we'll be able to make links and connections with members of the audience with our speakers, and hopefully that'll lead to some interesting interactions and maybe even future collaborations down the road. So on behalf of the audience and AOCS, Bryan, Sue, and Anthony, we really appreciate the time you spend in putting this together and the time you spent with us today. And we wish you all the success in your future endeavors, and look forward to seeing the press releases for the great success of Helaina and Canary and now Hudek. So congratulations, and we wish you all the success in the world.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil.
Yep.
And thanks to the AOCS. Thanks.
Yeah.